We're looking at the critical period between 100 and 325 AD. The apostles are gone. The texts that will become the New Testament have been written, but they are scattered, circulating independently across the Roman Empire, rather than as a single compiled canon. As the early church expands outward into a Greco-Roman culture dominated by Hellenistic philosophy, it absorbs converts from entirely alien worldviews. This creates an immediate intellectual crisis, a high probability of syncretism. To maintain their texts, early Christians had to simultaneously uphold three truths: strict monotheism, the full deity of Christ, and his genuine humanity. These pillars carry immense tension. Overemphasize one, the others bend under philosophical scrutiny, and the architecture collapses. The precise theological definitions ratified centuries later at councils like Nicaea and Chalcedon did not appear out of thin air. They were complex intellectual architectures, engineered iteratively by apologists forced to defend their texts against constant misinterpretation. Pre-Nicene Christology is an engineering problem. The early church had to forge a strict theological grammar to keep the exact mechanics of human redemption intact. The first philosophical pressure test is monarchianism, driven by a singular obsession: protecting the indivisible unity of God. To defend monotheism, it expands absolute numerical unity until it completely crushes the distinct deity of the Son out of existence. This structural failure takes two forms. The first is adoptionism, or dynamic monarchianism. In this view, Jesus is a wholly human man. He is not God the Son. Instead, a non-personal divine reason, the Logos, descends and merely empowers him at his baptism as a reward for moral virtue. Because the underlying Greek philosophy insists that God cannot suffer, this framework forces a severe conclusion. The divine power must retreat and fly back to heaven right before Jesus is crucified, leaving an ordinary man alone on the cross. This timeline visualizes modalism. God is one entity manifesting successively: Father in the Old Testament, Son in the Gospels, Spirit after Pentecost, never simultaneously. Without distinct simultaneous persons, redemptive history is meaningless. If the Son isn't distinct, he cannot offer a substitutionary sacrifice. This logic leads unavoidably to Patripassianism, the heresy that the Father himself literally suffered and died on the Roman cross. Monarchianism breaks the Christian system. Any intellectual framework that denies the personal distinctiveness of the Son mechanically dismantles substitutionary atonement. The second massive threat arrives through Gnosticism, a highly influential movement that imports rigid Platonic dualism directly into Christian thought. This maps Gnostic dualism. Reality splits. The upper spiritual realm is pure, while the lower physical world is inherently evil. Because God cannot touch evil matter, Gnostics introduce the demiurge, a flawed deity creating the physical universe and trapping divine souls inside physical bodies. Under this system, salvation is no longer the bodily resurrection promised in the biblical texts. It is an escape from the physical body entirely. This creates a direct crisis known as doceticism. If matter is evil, a pure heavenly Redeemer sent to rescue souls could never genuinely become flesh. Doceticism concludes that Christ only appeared to have a physical body, an optical illusion of humanity. The Spirit refuses to integrate with matter. Gnosticism offers an entirely alien conception of God. It eliminates the biblical reality of a creator who loves his physical creation enough to genuinely dwell within it, die within it, and redeem it. Faced with the destruction of their texts, early Christian apologists stepped up to forge a stabilizing grammar. This intellectual rebuilding phase begins with thinkers like Justin Martyr. Justin recognizes that he must speak to his culture. He utilizes Logos Christology to build a conceptual bridge between Hellenistic philosophy and Christian theology. Justin argues we share in a universal reason. The Christian claim is this universal Logos funneled down, becoming incarnate in Jesus. But this framing introduces ontological subordinationism. It makes the Son appear generated from the Father, rendering him slightly lesser in divine being. We must make an exact distinction here. Economic subordination is the biblical concept of the Son functionally submitting to the Father to accomplish redemption on earth. Ontological subordination is the fatal error of claiming the Son is lesser in his actual divine essence. The next major upgrade comes from Irenaeus of Lyon. He provides the massive structural fix required to permanently dismantle the Gnostic threat. This diagram illustrates Irenaeus's doctrine of recapitulation. Christ acts as the new representative head of humanity. He traces over the broken timeline of Adam, successfully obeying the Father at every single stage of human life where Adam failed. Recapitulation directly attacks Gnostic dualism. By emphasizing that Christ relived actual physical life, Irenaeus proves that salvation is the physical restoration of creation. Matter is completely compatible with the divine. Irenaeus establishes that the incarnate Christ had to be truly physically human, because if human nature is not assumed by God, human nature cannot be healed by God. To finally lock these axioms into place, the focus shifts to the Latin-speaking Western Church. Sometime before the year 200, a brilliant legal mind named Tertullian of Carthage finalizes the required lexical architecture. Tertullian introduces the phrase una substantia tres personae. By substance, he means the unbroken absolute beingness that makes God who he is, preserving monotheism. By person, he refers to distinct, simultaneous identities of action within that single being. Modalism is conceptually defeated. Tertullian applies this precision to the incarnation itself, arguing that Jesus is a single divine person possessing a twofold state, truly divine and truly human, without blending the two natures together. We return to our original problem. Tertullian's vocabulary finally stabilizes the structure. Monotheism, the deity of Christ, and the humanity of Christ can now coexist perfectly without collapsing into logical contradiction. By engineering the exact conceptual mechanism necessary to bypass both adoptionism and modalism, Tertullian gave the early church a reliable language to express the inexpressible. The intellectual journey of the pre-Nicene era reveals a crucial reality. Early Christians did not invent the deity of Christ to appease a pagan world. On the contrary, they fought relentlessly against the dominant philosophical molds of strict Greek dualism and reductive monarchianism, determined to preserve the historical reality embedded in the biblical text. Adoptionism, Sabellianism, and Gnosticism operate like severe software crashes. They are systems completely incapable of processing the simultaneous reality of a sovereign creator and a fully incarnate redeemer. The grammar of orthodoxy was forged in the fire of rigorous apologetic defense, utilizing the conceptual engineering of thinkers like Justin, Irenaeus, and Tertullian. Which brings the timeline forward to the year 325, the Council of Nicaea. Nicaea did not invent new theology. Instead, the council gathered these conceptual struts and enshrined them into the official conciliar law of the Church. The grammar of God was forged through centuries of severe intellectual stress testing. They engineered a framework robust enough to ensure that the mystery of a hypostatic union could be defended, confessed, and worshipped for millennia to come.